these emerging, digital policy issues. And those include cybersecurity, cyber threats, so what's the level of awareness for users on cyber threats, freedom of expression. Do users feel always comfortable to share different information on themselves with on the open internet, or would they prefer maybe to share them only in closed groups? And does gender impact on that in any way? Or does the level of education have an impact on how people share information online? So those are some of the questions that we will try to answer today and to discuss with the panelists. So I would like to start with a short presentation by one of our researcher and communications manager, Chennai Chair, who will give us a brief presentation on some of the initial fundings from these after access surveys. We are still at the beginning with the analysis of the survey. We just completed the first round in 7 African countries. We waited our results, so this is the first time that actually we are presenting our findings publicly in a public forum. And then we have with us, I would like also to briefly introduce our panelists. We have Wakabi Waragala, who is the director of CIPESA. He's a think tank and an advocacy organization working on Eastern African and Southern African countries on digital policy issues. We have Alexandrine Pirlot de Corbion. She's advocacy officer at Privacy International. Apologize for my pronunciation. And then we have Ursula Weinhoven. Is an ITU representative to the United Nations in New York. And then we have Yatanar Thun, who's the director at Myanmar ICT Development Organization. And then we have, we have another 2 speaker, George Vargas, is head of strategic partnerships for LATAM region at Wikimedia Foundation, and Eloani Hickok. She's co-director at the Center for Internet and Society in India. Okay, I would start with the presentation. So Chennai, you have the floor.
Okay, whilst the presentation is coming up, morning everyone. So thanks Enrico for the introduction. My name is Chennai. We've got it. It snowed and the presentation almost disappeared. So thank you for everyone. I'm just going to run quickly through this presentation as we're actually late. So I'm going to start from the second slide. Yep. So, I mean, the purpose of the research for us, as Enrico has pointed out, was trying to understand whether, with all this move towards access, we've actually got a developing digital rights divide, where there are some people with access to their rights or who understand what their rights are online, whereas there are new people coming online who don't understand the extension of their human rights offline to the online space. Next slide, please. Sorry, could I enter into full screen, please? Okay. So that slide just presents that there is still high levels of differences in internet use between urban and rural. So that takes into account that, or firstly, you can see that the total represents the levels of internet use within those countries. And then when you take a look at the rural and urban differences, you can find that, like, of the rural population that were interviewed, 15% still, in the case of Ghana, 15% only 15% were making use of the internet. And as you look further, you can find that most people who actually who make use of the internet are online, in urban areas. Next slide, please. And then once again, one of the big issues has been around the gender digital divide. It's still a persistent issue in these countries that we surveyed. And we found, like in the case of Rwanda, only 5% of the population that we interviewed that were female made use of the internet. So we still have striking measures and differences in terms of levels of use within the 7 African countries that we surveyed. Next slide, please. So whilst we are fully aware that there is a gap between rural and urban and male and female, we posed the questions around privacy concerns, where we wanted to find out if respondents, one of the barriers that we perceived might limit internet use could possibly be privacy concerns. And for us, what we found that most respondents do not see privacy as a big barrier to internet use. In South Africa, 0.47% of non-internet users, only 0.47% of non-internet users cited privacy as a concern. With the exception of Kenya and Rwanda, women cited privacy concerns as limiting their internet use. So there, once again, we can see that the gender digital divide is actually playing out when it comes to privacy concerns. Next slide, please. So in this slide, this actually just highlights the aggregates that we found from Kenya, Rwanda, and South Africa in terms of ranking of concerns around challenges to internet use. And I think only in Rwanda and South Africa, we can see a slightly significant percentage of people, well, below 10%, who are concerned with privacy. Next slide, please. So another issue that we looked at was around freedom of expression in terms of what content people were comfortable with putting online, as well as what content people were comfortable with discussing. So what we found interesting was that in Kenya, people were comfortable with talking about sexual orientation, whereas in South Africa, where the legislation is quite open for people to be comfortable with whatever sexual orientation they identify with, only 11.10% were actually comfortable with talking about their sexual orientation online. And then in terms, once again, South Africa is also a significant case where one would consider the environment to be open for everyone to talk about political issues. Only 28% of the people we interviewed were willing to express their political views online. Next slide, please. So then we thought about it, is it a case of self-censorship that then leads to people not being able to talk about the issues that, to talk about some issues online, in particular religious matters, political views, health issues, and we threw in an interesting one, gossip among friends. I call it interesting. So what we found was that in specific countries, for example, in Nigeria, people were least comfortable to talk about financial matters, 68%, and followed by political matters and health and sexual matters. Religious matters were the only ones that were likely to be discussed in public, and by public we mean that in any public forum, they didn't have to be in a specific group. And then gossip among friends is likely to be discussed within closed groups online, so the specific Facebook pages or the WhatsApp groups. And then in Rwanda, the issues that people were least comfortable to talk about were political, sexual health matters, and financial information. Once again, gossip and work-related issues were more likely to be discussed in closed groups. So this raised for us an interesting point that it seems as if, yes, to some extent, some people are comfortable with talking about issues online, but it's in a moderated space. It's in a space that they feel comfortable with, not just any public platform. Next slide, please. So that slide is cut out from there. Okay. So I don't know if you can lower it a little bit so that people can see the title of that slide. Thank you. So once again, we looked at how comfortable are you to discuss gossip between friends in all of these countries. And this is in correlation to the levels of education. And what we found was that people with lower levels of education, that is either no education at all or primary education, were least likely to be comfortable to talk about certain issues online. So in this particular case, it was gossip. Next slide, please. Well, in this particular case, it was the second slide. looks at comfort to discuss professional work-related information. People were not likely to discuss that publicly. But what we can see, once again, is the trend around being able to talk about issues in closed groups rather than in a public platform. Next, please. And then religious matters was something that was interesting for us as well. And what we find that, once again, in terms of education, when related to educational levels, people with a lower level of education are unlikely to feel comfortable to talk about religious matters online. Next slide, please. So one of the questions that we also asked was around, have you been a victim of online bullying? And what we found was, that's been interesting, was that when you look at the differences, so I'm going to have to explain this one quickly. So the blue represents males, the red represents females. And the two categories in each country are either no or yes. And what we found was that there weren't as high reported incidences around online bullying from the surveys. So this is what their responses would be, that have you ever been a victim of online bullying? And most of them would say no. And I think only in the case of, interestingly enough, in the case of Tanzania, we see that there's actually quite a high level response of, in comparison to the other countries, Tanzania and Ghana, response of, yes, I've experienced some form of online bullying. And in Ghana, it seems as if it's the men who experience most of the reported online bullying. So that's something that we actually need to further unpack to understand what level of education, what age is this that's experiencing this level of online bullying. Next slide, please. And then, so have you ever been confronted with unwanted, offensive, or inappropriate content? So this is a question that emerged from an earlier study that we did, qualitative study, where we had asked people what were the issues that they faced online, and a lot of them were talking about offensive, inappropriate, or bad content. They did not really quantify to say what exactly is bad content, but they described it as, so it could be bad content in terms of pornographic content, or it could be bad content in terms of anything that made them feel uncomfortable or went against their values. And in this instance, we looked at male and female, and sorry, I haven't changed my side. And you can actually also see that a lot of the times, in some instances, women, in the case of Rwanda, women were more likely to say no, they haven't experienced any unwanted content, whilst men were less. Men actually had experienced more exposure to unwanted content. Last slide, please. So, in essence, what we've just done is present a teaser to some of these issues that are emerging, and they still need to be unpacked to really understand who exactly is saying that they're experiencing these issues online. And perhaps the other question around it is also trying to understand the way in which people define privacy concerns or bullying online, because what may be described in a quantitative survey may be different in a qualitative survey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chennai, for this interesting presentation that sheds light on really how people perceive some of their digital rights online, right? Most of the time, these kind of discussions are informed either by a legal perspective, so when we discuss privacy, freedom of expression, and cybersecurity, cyber threats, we normally address these issues from a legal regulatory perspective. It's always difficult to bring in the evidence from users. There is some anecdotal evidence. We believe, based on anecdotal evidence on the chilling effect, but has never been really measured. So, my first question for Wakabi. You, in Eastern Africa and Southern Africa, you work on digital rights issue, both as conducting research and as an advocacy group. So, from your perspective, how can this kind of evidence inform policymakers, and how this kind of evidence can bring users' voice into policy-making debates on digital rights?
Thank you, Enrico. The advocacy is really difficult to do if you don't have evidence to back it up. And in many of our areas of operation, there is a shortage of evidence to inform the kind of advocacy which is going to have an impact with policymakers, but also with others who might want to join such efforts to drive the advocacy. So it is really important to establish what the status is of the issues that we are advocating for, and also come up with possible solutions before we are able to do the advocacy. Research on these matters, I think, has not always been wholesome in terms of addressing more traditional access issues, in terms of pricing, in terms of affordability, and linking that to issues of what is more mainstream taken as digital rights, such as privacy and free expression and access to information. I think what this research is doing, which would be very useful for people working in our field, is that it brings in both of those aspects. These are the costs. This is what is hindering people. This is where they feel they cannot speak. This is what is, sort of offending those who are online. So I think once we have both of those dimensions, then it becomes easier for us to be able to advocate. If I may say a little bit more on that, we have a lot of, for instance, broadband policies in our region. Most of the countries actually have broadband policies. But in reality, with very fine targets, but in reality, they have done next to zero in terms of making those policies achieve the targets that they set. There's little that has been done to reduce the cost of data, the cost of airtime. There is little that has been done in terms of getting marginalized groups to actually benefit and use the technologies and afford it. There are gender targets, but in reality nothing is done in many of these countries to enable more women access and gainfully use technologies. So I think this kind of research can also be used in terms of advocating to have policies such as ICT policies and broadband strategies infuse some of these issues that are being brought out by this research. Data protection, again, is something which the research has mentioned. In many of the countries, I think Chennai has told us that many people did not feel like the lack of protection of their data was a hindrance to use. But there are those, obviously, for whom it is an issue. And this protection is needed from governments, from companies, from individuals, because there are breaches, huge ones arising from all those actors. But the countries, we have just about, I think, 10 or 12 countries that have data protection policies. Without data protection policies, again, we obviously have issues of free expression, of offensive content, of not being comfortable to speak about certain issues that may hinder people from being able to gainfully use ICTs. So, in sum, we need research that speaks to various issues of access and affordability and rights and livelihoods. That is the evidence which we think we can use in order to gain the attention of other actors in this space, but also of policymakers.
Okay, thank you very much, Wakabi. And Alexandrine, from a again, privacy international perspective, we are expecting now by the end of May 2018 that all African countries. We're discussing African issues now. We'll need to be compliant with a new European regulation on data protection. And there are many debates on that, on how small and medium enterprises, and from an African perspective also the informal economy, will be able to be compliant, right? In order to protect the privacy of citizens. But from what we are actually seeing in this presentation, it seems that there is very little level of awareness from the majority of the population on what privacy is. So can you see any risk on that? And what do you think that, from a really European regulator perspective, why hasn't the user's perspective taken into account at all? Or has it been taken into account? Do they know what the situation is for the majority of the populations, in terms of the fact that there is not awareness on privacy, and which kind of repercussions do you think it will have once, we will arrive on that day when we will all be required to be compliant?
Great. Thank you very much to the organizers first for inviting us to be part of this conversation. Also, a short disclaimer, as Privacy International, we're based in London, but we work with an international network of partners, and we have 5 partners in Africa, which is sort of the work that we do with them that I'm going to be reflecting upon in the discussion now. In terms of the different questions posed, even though many people may be surprised to see the low level of awareness or concern with regard to privacy in the survey presented, it's actually something that we see quite a lot, not only in Africa, but in Europe and other regions as well. And I think it all comes down to how we talk to people about privacy and data protection, because we can be doing surveys and saying, do you care about privacy, or do you know what privacy is? But unless we break it down to what people can relate to, they won't be able to answer that question and be fully informed. And like I said, we work with an international network of partners of around 20 organizations, and this really reflects that people are concerned about privacy. All of these organizations are doing incredible work in their different national countries, because people are responding to some of the things they're seeing, but they're not sure how they can respond and what they can do about it. So I think another element when it comes to the low levels of awareness that we're seeing as well is it all comes down to some of the systemic problems that we're seeing around the lack of transparency and accountability of both government but also corporations. So how is an individual concerned about something if they're not even informed, or they don't even know it's happening? And particularly when it comes to some of the policies that we're seeing creep up in different countries, and not just in Africa again, but in terms of expensive surveillance laws in the name of terrorism, in the name of national security, but also, policies and practices such as SIM card registration, Wi-Fi registration. These are all things that are having an impact and interfering with the right to privacy, but individuals are not informed in the way that this is interfering with the right to privacy. They're saying, you need to do this so you can access this service. And I think we need to challenge the way in which we're having these discussions and to put it into perspective as to what the implications are of such practices and policies. Another aspect, which is a challenge that privacy advocates face a lot when undertaking their work, is often when it comes to privacy and data protection surveillance, you only see the implications, the harm, once it's occurred. And that's when people start caring, usually. And it shouldn't get to that. We shouldn't have to demonstrate the harm of something for policymakers to be taking into account the needs and the perspectives of users. We should be working in a more preventative way than waiting for it to go so far down the line that you actually have victims. So that's probably in terms of the GDPR kicking in, and it's been really interesting to have these different conversations with international actors and some of the policymakers working on drafting data protection laws, because as said by our colleague from CEPESA, there are only really 14 countries in Africa with data protection laws. So a lot of them are now looking to what's happening in Europe, but also elsewhere. And some are seeing as colonization 2.0 in terms of a European entity imposing a framework of how they should be running their affairs. But at the same time, I think it gives an opportunity as well to be, even though there are still problematic areas with the GDPR, of showing what is currently the highest standard in terms of data protection, particularly when it comes to informing citizens, more transparency from both government but also private actors when it comes to issues that are not visible in this sphere, be it profiling or tracking, the use of algorithms as well, or automated decision making, and particularly the emphasis the GDPR has put on giving more rights, or at least providing mechanisms to enforce the rights of data subjects. And these are all good practices, I think, that we can be integrating into the work that we're doing at the national level in terms of reforming laws that already exist in these 14 European African countries where this level is not at the standard we would want to see it, but in the countries like Uganda and Kenya, where there's still discussions and drafting processes to be integrating the high standards we could. We could be using the GDPR language and saying, if you don't adopt the GDPR standards, you will not be able to trade Europe, you will not be able to do all of these things. But I think at the same time we should focus on what the GDPR brings rather than focusing on the treaty, or what the legal instrument itself is, and saying like these are the fundamental principles you should be adopting when drafting and implementing a data protection law in your different countries. And maybe just a last point as well. I think what we're seeing in our engagement with our partners as well is how the issue of data protection and privacy is framed as well as a human rights issue. Very few national human rights institutions are actually integrating issues of data protection and privacy within their work, within their mandate, within their national reports. And as far as I know, actually, it's only the Human Rights Commission in Uganda who last year had a chapter on digital rights and with elements of privacy and surveillance, and we're trying to get them to integrate as well a chapter on privacy and data protection. But I think that all forms the discourse in terms of how people are perceiving these issues as well. Is it a human rights issue or not? And I think if we can frame it in that way, it will alert to people that data protection, privacy are actually on the same level that they should be concerned about as freedom of expression, as access to education, healthcare, non-discrimination, and other fundamental rights as well. So I think in terms of the framing, that can really help push the discourse, but also get people more engaged from civil society, but also different stakeholder groups, if we're able to frame it in that way. And then just a final point that I don't know if it's something that was addressed in the survey, but it's also around the choices and the alternatives that are given to users in different countries. A lot of the time, these are not accessible, or people are not informed that they have alternatives to the main platforms given to them that maybe have more exploitative business models. There are other alternatives, but are they always practical? When it comes to hardware, it becomes more of a luxury to be able to choose which hardware you can use. And so we need to make those more accessible in that way as well, both in terms of services, hardware and software, that the users can choose and make an informed decision as to what they want to be using based on how they're using these different platforms.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexandrine. What you are saying, I think it highlights also the fact that, and specifically related to this kind of research, that there might be, within the population, a substantial group of the population that is just not informed or does not have enough skills to really understand issues around digital rights. So while on the one hand, maybe there is a portion of the population that is more educated, that has got more knowledge on differences across platforms or hardware, knows how to protect himself, the first level of cyber security, and therefore they are able to somehow to enforce this kind of rights, right, at an individual level. There is a big portion of the population that instead might be completely left, out from that, and there might be really risks of vulnerability. So those are new and emerging debates that historically has not really been discussed. But for instance, Eloani, from your perspective, the Center for Internet Society works on this kind of issues, and in Asian countries, in India in particular, you might have this portion of the population, right, as well, that might not be prepared to enforce their own rights online. So how a group like yours can try somehow to include them in the debate, to make them more aware of what their rights are, and to protect them online, even if their choices are less, they don't have enough knowledge on what platforms and alternatives are, and they might not know how to avoid cyber risks that are there.
Thank you for that presentation as well. That was really interesting. So a couple of things, just to echo a little bit of what Alex was saying. I think it's really important, the language that we use when we're talking about privacy, and we try to ask people about do they care about privacy online, offline, because it can be understood in a variety of ways, especially something like privacy, because it can be so personal. It's a little bit different when you're talking about access, right? You're taking a survey and you're trying to measure, do these people, or do you have access to the internet? That's a very easy thing to do a survey on. We've always found that doing a survey on something like privacy or freedom of expression is difficult, because there's such a wide variety of interpretations and reasons why somebody might be responding a certain way. And so we've looked at surveys that have been done in the Indian context and tried to contextualize those with legal frameworks, with political situations, and then also see how those surveys can inform policy. India's at a really interesting place right now with respect to privacy in particular. We just recognized privacy as a fundamental right, and they're considering they're in the process of drafting a privacy legislation. And one of the debates that is emerging is if India needs to take a more paternalistic approach, given perhaps low levels of awareness, and the variety of awareness that you'll find across sectors in India, and so that's really interesting to me, because in some ways it's taking this kind of data, looking at levels of awareness, and then trying to say what is the very high level approach to a privacy legislation that we need to take, and that would be appropriate for India. And I think these numbers can also be useful when you're looking at education gaps. And so with any right and enabling any right, I think there is a massive amount of education that needs to go into it. When India recognized the right to information, they had huge campaigns about enabling people on how to use this right. What does this mean? What can you ask the government? And now it's a very robust right in India, but it took a lot of groundwork. And so I think if it would be interesting to dig into something like privacy and awareness around privacy, and really start to understand how are people using services, and where are certain education gaps, and using that to guide very large amounts of education. I think that could be really interesting. I think maybe I'll go ahead and stop there.
Thank you. And George, Wikimedia represents one of the main platforms for to access and to share knowledge. But I think what we can see from this platform is that actually different groups of people feel comfortable with sharing certain kind of information or not, and maybe might have wrong perceptions on how the platform works, and therefore they might feel more comfortable with contributing with some content rather than other content. And as a result, I believe that might shape actually how that kind of knowledge is produced and how it's shared. Now, does Wikimedia do any work on inclusion of different groups, and on making them feel comfortable and safe while they produce online content and access local content? Some content can be considered inappropriate according to different cultures and beliefs. So, what's the role of Wikimedia in that respect?
Well, first of all, allow me to introduce a little bit of the Wikimedia Foundation and how Wikipedia works. I hope that you're all aware of the existence of Wikipedia, Wikipedia being a free online encyclopedia that's been around for over 15 years, and it's fully created by millions of volunteers around the world that research, edit, and curate the content. The role of the Wikimedia Foundation is to basically be in the background, keep the sites running, maintain the websites, maintain the applications, do the partnerships, do the legal work, but at the same time, it's to support our community. And definitely a big part of supporting our community is taking into consideration these different issues like how to make people feel more safe in order to be able to create content, how people can not have any privacy concerns when they're accessing certain kind of content. Because at the end of the day, we care about access to knowledge and access to free knowledge. And as people start going online or people start using the internet in general, in order to be able to have real access to knowledge, we think that they need to feel safe. They need to feel that their privacy is being considered. And they also need to feel that they can be part of knowledge creation. Sometimes there's the perception of knowledge being created from above and not something that you can create oneself to share with the world. And that's definitely one of the big tenets that we in the Wikimedia movement try to foster and push with all of our communities. A little bit of a plug to talk about our movement and the communities in Africa and how this research and all of this information will be very relevant for them and for us. First of all, I should congratulate you for this wonderful research. I think that it's a very innovative and new approach to start asking this kind of questions that we need to know from people in the ground that rather be creating or making assumptions, sitting in a desk in San Francisco in order to be able to actually serve our community. So this is wonderful information. In order to talk a little bit about the work that we have in Africa, we can say that we have a thriving and amazing community emerging in Africa. For instance, our annual celebration or our annual big conference called Wikimania that changes every year. Next year is going to take place in Cape Town, so all of our community is very excited there. We have a lot of work being done in Nigeria, in Ghana, in South Africa, and emerging communities in Tanzania and other places that are starting to care more and more about knowledge creation. So because these communities are starting to foster this local content creation and start getting involved into access to knowledge, I can share a little bit of what we within the Wikimedia Foundation do in order to protect those rights for people to feel safe. Our first and most important thing is the privacy policy that we worked for with the Wikimedia Foundation. We take privacy very seriously in the sense that we want people to feel that anonymity or pseudonymity is okay when posting something, when reading something. And for this, we have very minimum data protection, data collection. We don't request people to sign up. We don't need people to share their personal information if they want to create content or if they want to read any content. As far as the content itself has a proper research, a proper citation, has rules of neutrality, verifiability. It doesn't matter who's posting it or who is reading it. So this privacy policy was actually created by a lot of the volunteers that basically started stating what their privacy concerns were, what their privacy needs were, and how the foundation should create its own privacy policy based on that, and not a privacy policy that was built from, let's say, a unilateral perspective from the foundation in San Francisco. So that's kind of like one of our big ideas that we've done there to protect privacy and data protection. At the same time, in order for people to feel safe, we try to foster and foment different programs that aim to address issues of harassment. And for this, we have several training programs around anti-harassment. We try to have code of conducts and friendly space policies, both online and offline in different kinds of events. But still, all of these things are issues that in emerging communities need to be, there needs to be more awareness of, right? Like all of these policies are clearly informed by people that have been online and on Wikimedia for over 10, 15 years. And some people not necessarily are aware of the concerns or the issues that could exist around privacy or around safety when being on Wikipedia. And that's why we try to not only care from the beginning to have them in the safest environment possible, but to try to educate and raise awareness. And for this, we do a lot of work with our community. Finally, and just to kind of like leave a final teaser and allow room for more time, we also do a lot of partnership work. My team, particularly partnerships and the Global Reach team, what we do in the foundation is to find partnerships in order to foster inclusion of those people that are being left behind for any different reasons, right? It could be access barriers or it could be cultural barriers. And for this, we look into different programs that address, for example, the gender gap and the creation of content for women and by women. We support different efforts and partnerships, not only done by international organizations, including ITU with Equals or the Web Foundation, but also initiatives in the communities like a recent contest that I love sharing. It's called La Mujer que Nunca Conociste, or The Woman That You Have Never Met. And it's this idea that was nascent in Latin America by our community to just encourage people to create content about relevant women in their countries that was not already on Wikipedia, to also address the gap, the gender gap, not only of people participating, but of content available about women and relevant to women. I'll leave it there, and thanks again for this invitation.
Thank you very much, George, for this very interesting intervention on how Wikimedia is trying to create awareness on one hand and a very inclusive space on the other hand. And tonight presented some research results on the gender differences in terms of digital rights. And our sister organization, LearnAsia, has conducted similar research in Southern Asian countries, and we have with us Yatanar from Myanmar, who has conducted some research, especially on gender differences. And Yatanar, would you like to share some findings on the Myanmar, from a Myanmar perspective, on the gender gaps and perceptions of these rights?
So I have 2 points here. Before that, I want to introduce myself. I'm Yadana from a local organization called MIDO, Myanmar ICT for Development Organization. Together with LearnAsia, we conduct some researches around digital rights. So based on 2 nationally representative surveys of ICT use, where we surveyed about 12,000 people in Myanmar in 2015 and 16, the gender divide in mobile phone ownership is significant in Myanmar and has been around 28% in both years, sorry, I don't have a slide here. So yeah, so 28% in both years. So that means that is nothing changed in gender divide within 1 year, and it's surprising because Myanmar is a society that gives a strong place for women, and I mean, unlike in other countries in Southeast Asia in that aspect. So, and our qualitative work from 2016 shows that women are indeed the financial decision makers in their family. So everyone in the family gives them the money or earning at the end of the month, and she has to allocate the budget. So she will indeed decide how much to spend on a phone and when. But because she doesn't have the technical knowledge or network to get this information, she has to rely on men or friends or son or husband to go to the shop and buy the phone. And the phone often travels with man or son or daughter from the family who is working or studying outside of the country, outside of the home. So the women who mostly work at home doesn't have access to it, and so even in a society like Myanmar, when women are more empowered, I mean compared to India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan in the region, so still women are at a disadvantage in having access. Then we also talked to more than 100 people who are current user of internet, and we did some focus group and in-depth interviews with them. We interview men, women, transgender people. These people are included in our sample, and what we saw is that even when online, women face different types of problems, and therefore have to behave differently to men. Because of problem, like for example, women were harassed online. For example, they say like, "Can you lift your skirt, take a picture, and send it to me?" You know, like that kind of comments from stranger that they received, and some women repeatedly say that say how images of women are photoshopped. So it always happen, you know, like they Photoshop into nudes, editing their bodies to, you know, and then post it online. So those people we interview, they said they don't post their photos of online, or sometimes post only a photo of their face, assuming that these are harder to Photoshop. So self-censorship is very common in our country. And men never mentioned this as a problem, I mean, according to our research. And some of the women we interviewed, they said they often use male identity and adopt male personnel, and they check male in gender box if gender is X, especially on social media and Facebook. So they think this is the way to participate online and access information while not being harassed based on gender. And the same as the previous point, men never mentioned this as you know, something they do. And sometimes women often post a photo of their husbands and kids in their profile picture, even when they identify as female, and because this is a way of signaling, you know, the world, like, I'm a woman, but look, I have a family and I'm married and have a child, and they want to seem as a way to get harassed less. And sometimes women don't even bother to open an account. They just use their, you know, husband account to access Facebook because they think because they feel like it is safer. So these are some of the points we found from our research. I mean, men of course had problems mostly, but those problems are mostly related to their phones or to their accounts. But none of the above gender-specific problems were experienced by, by those men. I mean, according to our research.
Thank you very much, Yetanar, for these very enlightening findings, because they really show that there might be, based on this kind of differences, of risks, if you are a man, woman, or a transgender person, there might be also a need really of developing maybe different tools, strategies, or advocacy campaign to really try to meet needs of different groups of people. My last question, last but not least, is for Ursula. Wakabi briefly mentioned that one of the relevant issues on ICT policy, especially in developing countries in Africa, historically has been broadband access. And the ITU has done considerable work on that respect. In particular, I would like to mention the partnership on measuring the information society, and this very important contribution on trying to understand level of access and use of ICT across the population, both from a demand side and supply side perspective, to really try to develop informed points of policy intervention, right, on this evidence. But as we see, as more and more people move online, there are new emerging and relevant issues. For instance, on cybersecurity, privacy, freedom of expression, and so on and so forth. So, what do you think? Would that be relevant to include some of these new digital rights, let's call them like that, indicators in the work that the ITU has done on measuring the information society? Would that be relevant? Not? Is this actually terrain that is not covered by the ITU, and then maybe other organizations might do it better? What do you think? What's your view on that?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting us. We're really pleased to participate, and congratulations for the research that was done. One of the challenges in all of these areas is lack of data, including sex disaggregated data, including, as you mentioned, so that there can be more targeted policy interventions, etc. For those who might not know, the ITU, with the International Telecommunication Agency, Union, we are the UN specialized agency for ICTs. We've been around since 1865, actually when the T stood for telegraph. So we've been around a long time. And specifically what we do, we are really focused on trying to bring half the world that's not yet connected online. As we all know, in the Sustainable Development Goals, which set all the different goals and targets for 2030, one, however, which is set for 2020, just 3 years from now, is the universal connectivity. So we're very focused on that, and in particular looking at issues of digital divides, including the gender digital divide, and also trying to unpack what are the rationales behind these divides, which are holding people back in accessing ICTs, and all the benefits they can bring for the full array of the Sustainable Development Goals. So, for instance, some of the issues that have been found, as we know, for the digital divides include things like cost and relevance of content, cultural norms, location, literacy level, and importantly for the work you're doing, also safety and security, time and even competing priorities, lack of electricity often in a lot of cases, lack of self-confidence to use technology and digital resources, and of course concerns about safety and security can also impact that. And these kinds of issues can disproportionately affect women and girls, and so remain important determinants for benefiting from the full array of opportunities that the internet provides. And some of these concerns, as the other speakers have highlighted, include concerns around issues like harassment online, and even in terms of violence or harassment that women may experience in even purchasing a phone. If they have to buy a phone from a man, and they may, be asked for passwords, etc. And there are reported instances of women having negative experiences in those kind of contexts. So there's definitely some really exciting work also going on in terms of, for instance, providers specifically working with women franchisees and promoters so that women can actually engage with other women and to reduce these kind of concerns, which can help bring a lot more women online. Because a key statistic around this is that at the moment there's 250 million less women online than men. And in a lot of cases also, when they even are online, they're using it less. So there are definitely a lot of issues around this. So just to underscore again that having more disaggregated data, is incredibly important to be able to have these more targeted approaches and is really useful for all societal actors concerned. I would also just mention that, as you know, the UN system, of course, consists of many different entities with complementary mandates. So some of the themes that you talked about and flagged, such as freedom of expression and privacy, etc., are of course worked on also in the context of the Human Rights Council and the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, and they have special rapporteurs who are looking at these issues and who are increasingly looking also at the questions of these issues in the digital world. And governments themselves, in a resolution that have just recently passed in New York called ICTs for Development, also in that resolution underscore that people must have the same rights online that they have offline. So sometimes what we're seeing is this kind of paradox that ICTs, of course, bring so many opportunities for realization and enjoyment of rights and improvement of livelihoods, etc. In the case of some areas such as gender equality, challenges that women face in the analog world can be accentuated online, but at the same time the ICTs also offer the opportunity to actually help address some of the gender equality challenges that women face in the analog world, including through access to education, livelihoods, financial services, building new communities that can make it a lot easier to access these than they have in the analog world. So there are those different dimensions, and certainly, as some of the other speakers have mentioned, as we see these new technologies becoming available, like AI, etc., Internet of Things, big data, some of these opportunities and challenges also can be accentuated. So one of the things that happens in the ITU context, there's a lot of standard development in a multi-stakeholder context where governments and others come together to discuss key issues like cybersecurity and technologies that can enhance that, and similarly on the privacy piece too. So thanks again for inviting us.
Thank you very much, Ursula, and thank you also for highlighting the importance of good quality and relevant data for targeted approaches, and on actually the value of demand-side data that it allows to disaggregate these kind of indicators across different demographics, gender, level of education, level of income. It won't be possible to do it in any other way. I would like to open up the microphone to the floor, or maybe to somebody remotely. Is there any question or any comment on what we discussed this morning? Any contribution? Yeah. I'd like to briefly introduce yourself as well. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Anju, and I'm from Fiji, and I represent the small island developing states in the Pacific. The research is really good. I just wondered if your focus was on vulnerable people. So did you focus a lot on the persons with disability, one? And communities like agriculture sector, health sector, did they participate in this research? And the other, can I ask another one? In terms of best practices and good practices, I think I'm a bit short. In terms of good practices and best practices, have you guys done any outreach or engagement plan on data protection policies? Like you mentioned something about making end users understand what it really means, but have you got any best practices on that?
I would like to take maybe another one or two questions, and then we'll ask our panelists to answer. Yeah.
this research, it's very, very good, and we can see like differences between men and women. But in terms of we said the vulnerable people, have you in your research have you include the LGBT groups like and also the because in gender we also have men and women, and other groups also have it. So how, and also it is important to include in a human rights perspective as well. So we also want to learn, and like if there are any findings on the research. Thank you very much.
Is there one last question? Or, okay, maybe Chennai, would you like to answer?
Yeah. Okay, so if I missed something out, please do it on to me. So thank you very much for the questions with regards to who we actually were interviewing. So I think what I've just presented is like high level, where we didn't actually do a cross cut to see did we interview people with disabilities. But I think, Enrico, did we have a question on differently abled with people with disabilities in the survey?
Yeah, I don't think we included the disability.
So one thing that we are aware with our survey is that there are certain communities that we actually do not get to, and that is something, so in particular LGBTI community, we've worked on gender research, and one thing that we do point out is that surveys can only go as far as they can go. There are certain communities that you actually need to have specifically designed research that goes into those communities and asks the targeted questions. So at this, with one point with the surveys is to get that nationally representative data. But when it comes to actually like LGBTI community and specific gender issues, moving away from we actually like to say this, what we're presenting is sex disaggregated data. It's male and female. We haven't really got into the real juicy gender issues. But what we do then is take the research a step further by having qualitative surveys or qualitative interviews, which is what I really work on myself and Anri. And one area that we actually want to take this research further is to look at women within refugee communities or refugee camps, because what we're trying to argue is that the data that we have at this one level represents just a particular subset of people that we can reach out to. But in like certain African communities, it's difficult to go in and ask, so what do you identify as? Whereas that community does not want to talk about people having different sexualities at all. So we did, having that one question of, do you want to talk about sexual orientation, we didn't probe it further to say, are you then going to identify as not being the accepted norm in your community? And then when it comes to specific agricultural communities, we do have a subsection of questions that try to ask people, what is it that you're doing? So we capture your daily activity, and then in the next, as we take the research further, we can actually do like a cross-analysis to say, people who conduct this particular activity, are they then concerned with this issue of privacy? And we also have like a youth study as well, which I didn't mention, but that's another thematic we're trying to understand for young people who are driving internet use in the continent. What are their issues that they face online?
Okay. Is there anybody who would like to answer to the question on advocacy?
Maybe on your question about best practices, there's a project called the Ranking Digital Rights Project, and it's based in the U.S., but it's ranking 22 of the world's largest ICT companies. And if you look at their methodology, it is a very comprehensive compilation of best practices in terms of what companies' practices and policies should look like to enable users' digital rights. So it goes into, essentially what does a company need to disclose to enable the user in terms, like in their privacy policies, in their terms of service. So we've been contributing to that, and I think it's a really good place to start when you're looking at best practices.
On the issue of privacy and data protection, last month, CIPESA, the organization I work with, helped draft a report on best practices, but also looking at the model law on data protection in Southern Africa, There's another one in the West African Region Economic Bloc, and then also in the East African region, there's some guidelines on data protection. So what we helped do is to draft a paper that compares the three, but also looks at international best practice, if there's anything like that, and then to recommend what we feel is not right with some of these regional instruments, but also some of the national data privacy laws. That paper was presented at the African Union Ministers of ICT meeting last month. Eventually, the idea is that we will have that finalized. We are the second actor. There's a principal actor, and then CPESA is like the bridesmaid. But we are so to finalize it and have the African Union accept and endorse that, and then we can be able to use that as an advocacy tool within the different African countries.
Thank you, Wakabi. Do we have any other question, or we've got actually only 1 minute? Would you like a final one? Okay, thank you. So our sister organization, Learn Asia, conducts research on a few certain Asian countries. I do not have the list with me, but I can easily let you know to see if the countries that you are interested in are included in this kind of research. And is there any final remark from our panelists?
Maybe just on the question around Pacific and Caribbean, we work through a network of partners, and we don't have partners there at the moment, but we have been monitoring what's been happening in Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica as well, around data protection laws that are being drafted. So if you come across a text, and please get in touch, and we're going to publish early next year a framework that allows non-practitioners, non-lawyers to be able to assess data protection laws, to see what to look out for. So we are going to make this tool available, but we're always happy to provide input. So yeah.
I just wanted to mention that we are just about to embark on a project with a partner where we're going to look at all broadband policies and digital strategies, and look for all of the different vulnerable groups that are mentioned in the SDGs, to see what are the practices and policies that governments already have around the world, to be able to pull them together so that governments can also be inspired by different practices that they see already being in place around the world. And then finally, I just wanted to mention, for those who are interested in the gender digital divide, which is hopefully everybody, I just wanted to flag that there's an online consultation going on right now of the ITU's Council Working Group, and they're accepting online submissions until 23 December 2017. And you can even submit PDFs or links to your existing work. But I really want to flag it because I think what is really important is that even just the sheer number of submissions that are made help convey to governments the importance of these kinds of issues. So I just invite people to consider using this channel as well as an opportunity to flag the different issues that they're interested in working on and that they're already doing work on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and a round of applause for our panelists, for all of you. Okay, we have to close the session. Thank you for being here, and so this data actually will be very soon released in the public domain around June, and it will be possible to download it from our website, Research ICT Africa. Or you can even discuss also with us, how to get there, how to get access to this data, how to analyze it. You are all very welcome actually to contribute with the analysis of this data. It's a very rich data set of a very comprehensive set of indicators. Thank you, and enjoy the IGF, the rest of the IGF. Sorry. And we have also have got tea. South African tea is rooibos. Is there outside for you. You can have it here or take it at home for you. It's our small Christmas presents from researchers at the Africa team. Thank you.
Hi, I do, yes. Enrico.
with you, and then I was just like, there's a specific I'm not going to do this. It was terrible on that, on it in general, because I know that that's one of the issues that we are having. We don't have things already. I'll catch up with you. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
And I think that's
So cool. I was just talking to like Jen, it's like really, really great information.
Where do you want us to sit? Let's sit here.
For sure. It was great meeting you as well.
Okay, thank you. See you later.
No, I was going to say, like, I hope to see you on Wednesday. This is something
Thanks,
that
I'll
maybe
actually remind both of us.
share in that context. I think it would be like
You know, in case you want to use to anybody, I'll be getting more.
yes,
Sure.
like in general, like access to knowledge and information and the barriers that like we usually talk about, right, like the technical and
I think you sent me an email about
but it's
tomorrow
also
night.
we want to focus on
Yes.
what are those emerging barriers that people are talking about, right? Like so like what are you discovering, right? Like people also care about this stuff that people are not really getting used to, like information collection.
Jake is into that.